Montana Romance by Weston Ford. The Rocky Ranch stretched over acres of rolling Montana land, nestled between the towering Rocky Mountains and vast meadows dotted with wildflowers. A quiet serenity hovered in the air, interrupted only by the occasional whinny of horses or the rustling of wind through tall pines. The ranch had been in Sarah Hartwell's family for generations, and after her father's passing, it was now hers. Sarah stood on the porch, her calloused hands gripping the railing as she looked out over the land that had raised her. It was late spring, and the grass swayed in gentle waves, bright green under the early morning sun. The sky stretched endlessly, a soft blue that seemed to go on forever. For many, this kind of life would be lonely, but for Sarah, it was exactly where she belonged, or at least where she thought she did. It had been 2 years since she had returned to the ranch, leaving behind the hustle of city life. The transition had been jarring at first. Nights felt eerily quiet without the constant hum of city traffic, and the open spaces made her feel exposed, as though the land itself was watching her. But over time, she had come to appreciate the quietness. It allowed her to think, to grieve, and ultimately, to heal. But there was one thing missing, a sense of companionship. Not just from other people, but from life itself. The ranch, despite its beauty, had grown stagnant. The fields were fertile, the horses healthy, but Sarah knew something needed to change if she was going to preserve her family's legacy. That was when she decided to reach out to her old friend, Emma, who ran a nearby veterinary clinic. Emma had always been a source of support, and Sarah hoped she might have some advice on how to breathe new life into the ranch. During their catch-up over coffee at the local diner, Emma mentioned her brother, Will, who had recently returned from working on ranches in Wyoming. "He's looking for a new start," Emma said. "Maybe you two could help each other out." Sarah was hesitant at first. She had grown accustomed to her solitude, and the idea of bringing someone new into her world felt daunting. But Emma's warm smile and reassuring words convinced her to at least meet Will. A few days later, Will arrived at the ranch. He walked up the dirt path with a quiet confidence, his cowboy hat tipped low, casting a shadow over his kind eyes. Ranching was in his blood, just like it was in hers. When he introduced himself, hat in hand, offering his experience and help, something in his demeanor told Sarah that he wasn't just looking for a job. He was searching for a place to belong to. They started working together, a quiet partnership forming between them. Will was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He cared for the horses as if they were his own, always making sure the tack was properly oiled and the stalls were clean. He had a way with the animals that even Sarah found impressive. The horses, usually skittish around strangers, warmed to him quickly. As days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself drawn to Will's steady presence. They didn't need to talk much. Just being near him brought a strange comfort. But with that comfort came fear. Sarah had lost before, her mother to illness when she was a child, and her father's death had left an even deeper wound. Loving someone meant opening herself up to that kind of pain again, and she wasn't sure she could do it. Will seemed to sense her hesitation. He never pushed, never asked questions about her past. Instead, he offered his presence, his work ethic, and his gentle encouragement as they tackled the ranch's never-ending to-do list. Together, they worked side by side fencing the north pasture, repairing the old barn roof, and bringing in supplies from the nearby town of Livingston. It was during one of those supply runs that Sarah began to feel the first stirrings of something deeper. The drive into town was long, and they often took the old pickup truck. The windows rolled down as the cool mountain air swept through the cab. On this particular trip, they had barely spoken, each lost in their own thoughts. As they passed a field of wildflowers, Sarah finally broke the silence. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the wind. "I mean, really leaving? Going somewhere where there's more?" Will glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "More than this?" He gestured to the rolling hills and the distant mountains. "Can't say I've ever wanted more than this." Sarah smiled softly, but her thoughts were more complex than she let on. She had left once, chasing the allure of city lights and fast-paced living. But after a few years, she had found herself longing for the simplicity of ranch life, the kind of life her father had taught her to cherish. Yet, there was always a lingering doubt in her mind. Was she settling for what was familiar, or had she truly found what made her happy? As if sensing her inner turmoil, Will spoke again. "I think everyone wonders about leaving at some point," he said, "but it's not about where you are, it's about what makes you feel alive." Sarah stared at him, surprised by his words. Will didn't often speak so openly, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something deeper in him, something he kept hidden behind his calm exterior. That evening, after they returned to the ranch and finished unloading the supplies, Will suggested they take the horses out for a ride. It had been a long day, but Sarah found herself agreeing. There was something about the idea of riding through the open fields as the sun set that called to her. They saddled up, Sarah on her father's old mare Misty, and Will on Ranger, a spirited horse with a wild streak. The two of them rode in comfortable silence, the rhythm of the horse's hooves steady beneath them. As they crested a hill, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting everything in a golden glow. The air was cool, the scent of pine and earth filling their lungs as they slowed their pace to a walk. It was in this moment, with the vast expanse of land before them and the quiet hum of nature surrounding them, that Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of peace. They stopped by the river, the water glistening in the fading light. Will dismounted first, tying Ranger to a nearby tree. He gestured for Sarah to join him by the water's edge. As she slid off Misty's back and walked beside him, Sarah couldn't help but notice how close they were standing. The warmth of his presence was palpable, and it stirred something in her, something she had been trying to suppress since the day he had arrived. Will was the first to break the silence, his voice low. "I've been thinking." His words hung in the air, making Sarah's heart skip a beat. She had a feeling she knew what he was about to say, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to hear it. "What about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his eyes serious. "About this place, about us." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Will's gaze held hers, the intensity in his eyes more revealing than any words could be. Sarah had always prided herself on reading people, but Will's quiet nature had kept her at arm's length, emotionally speaking. Now, standing by the river, with the cool breeze tugging at her hair and the horses gently nuzzling the grass behind them, there was no escaping the connection between them. "Us?" she repeated, her voice almost drowned out by the gentle rush of the river. Her heart raced, pounding against her ribs as though it, too, sought release from all the emotion she had bottled up for so long. Will didn't flinch, his steady calm unnerving yet reassuring at the same time. "I know you've been through a lot, Sarah. I can see it in the way you carry yourself. And I won't pretend to know everything, but I can see that you're trying to protect yourself." Sarah's throat tightened. He wasn't wrong. Losing her father had left a scar she wasn't ready to acknowledge, a wound she had tried to cover by throwing herself into ranch life. She had convinced herself that if she kept busy enough, if she didn't allow herself to feel too deeply, she could keep the pain and any possibility of future heartbreak at bay. "I don't need protection," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't the truth. She had built walls around her heart, ones that had kept her isolated from the world, from love. Will nodded, understanding without pushing. "I know you don't," he replied softly, "but sometimes it's okay to let someone in, to let yourself feel again." Sarah blinked, her eyes stinging with the emotion she had tried to ignore for so long. She turned away, focusing on the river, the steady flow of water offering a temporary distraction. But Will didn't step back. He was patient, his presence grounding her in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "I've been alone for a long time, Will," she admitted quietly. "I don't know if I can." She didn't finish the sentence, unsure of how to put her fears into words. What if she let herself fall for him, only to lose him too? The thought of opening herself up again, of being vulnerable, terrified her more than anything else. Will took a step closer, his hand brushing hers. The simple touch sent a feeling of warmth, comfort through her. "You don't have to decide right now," he said, his voice low and soothing. "But just know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The sincerity in his words was undeniable. Will wasn't like the others who had drifted in and out of her life. He had been steady, reliable, and caring since the day he arrived. He hadn't asked for anything in return, hadn't tried to push her into something she wasn't ready for. He had simply been there, a quiet presence in her life, offering support without expectation. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility of something more. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "Will," she began, her voice trembling slightly. But before she could finish, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Startled, they both turned to see one of the ranch's younger hands, Jesse, riding toward them in a hurry. His face was flushed, and his horse kicked up dust as he galloped over. "Sarah." "Will," Jesse called out breathlessly as he reined in his horse. "We've got trouble." Sarah's heart sank. "What is it?" Jesse wiped the sweat from his brow. "There's a fire over by the north pasture. It's spreading fast." In an instant, the tension between Sarah and Will evaporated, replaced by the urgency of the situation. Sarah's mind raced as she turned to Misty, quickly untying her reins. "How bad is it?" she asked, already mounting her horse. "Bad," Jess replied, his voice tight. "The wind's picking up and we don't have much time." Will was already in the saddle, his jaw set in determination. "We need to get back now. If that fire reaches the barn..." Sarah didn't need to hear the rest. The barn was full of hay and supplies. not to mention several horses that hadn't been let out to pasture that day. If the fire reached them, the damage could be catastrophic, not just to the ranch, but to the lives of the animals that depended on her. Without another word, they spurred their horses into a gallop, the wind whipping through Sarah's hair as they raced back toward the ranch. The peaceful evening was shattered, the tranquil beauty of the land marred by the growing threat of flames. When they reached the north pasture, Sarah's worst fears were realized. A wall of fire stretched across the dry grass, inching closer to the wooden fence that bordered the barn. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and choking, making it hard to see or breathe. "We need to get the horses out of the barn," Sarah shouted over the roar of the flames. Will nodded, his face grim. "You take the left side, I'll handle the right. We'll get them out and drive them to the south pasture." Sarah didn't hesitate. She dismounted and ran toward the barn, her heart pounding in her chest. The heat from the fire was intense, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air. But she couldn't afford to be afraid. The horses were panicked, their frightened whinnies echoing in the distance. Throwing open the barn doors, Sarah rushed inside. The horses stomped and tossed their heads, sensing the danger. She moved quickly, untying them from their stalls and leading them out into the open air, where Jesse and a few of the other ranch hands were waiting to guide them to safety. One by one, they got the animals out, but the fire was spreading faster than they had anticipated. The dry grass acted like tinder, feeding the flames as they crept closer to the barn. Just as Sarah was about to grab the last horse, a young mare named Daisy, she heard a loud crack. The fire had reached the fence, and a section of it collapsed in a shower of sparks. "Sarah, look out." Will's voice cut through the chaos. She turned just in time to see a large beam from the barn ceiling begin to fall, its supports weakened by the fire. With a gasp, she darted out of the way, narrowly avoiding the heavy wood as it crashed to the ground where she had just been standing. "Get out of there," Will shouted, his voice filled with urgency. But Sarah couldn't leave Daisy behind. The mare was trembling, her eyes wide with fear, refusing to move. Sarah grabbed the lead rope and pulled, her voice gentle but firm. "Come on, girl, we've got to go." Daisy resisted for a moment longer, but Sarah's calm persistence finally broke through. The mare stepped forward, and together they hurried out of the barn just as another section of the roof collapsed behind them. Outside, the air was thick with smoke, and the flames were dangerously close to the barn. Will was already at her side, his face smudged with soot as he helped guide Daisy to safety. They worked together, side by side, until every horse had been evacuated and the fire crews arrived to battle the blaze. The flames raged on for hours, but by the time dawn broke, the worst of the fire had been contained. Exhausted, Sarah leaned against the fence, watching as the last embers smoldered in the distance. The barn was damaged but not entirely lost, thanks to their quick efforts. The horses were safe grazing peacefully in the south pasture, oblivious to the danger they had just escaped. Will stood beside her, his arm brushing hers as they both stared out at the smoky horizon. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The adrenaline from the night had worn off, leaving behind only a quiet sense of relief. "You saved her," Will said finally, his voice low. "Daisy." Sarah nodded, her heart still racing from the close call. "I couldn't leave her behind," she murmured. "She's part of the ranch, just like everything else." Will turned to face her, his expression softening. "And what about you, Sarah? Are you part of the ranch too?" She blinked, surprised by the question. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized what he meant. The ranch was her life, her legacy. But it wasn't the land or the buildings that made it home. It was the people, the connection she had formed, the love she had for the animals, for the land, and maybe, just maybe, for Will. "I think I am," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Will reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "Then stay," he said softly. "Stay with me. Here, we can build something together if you're ready." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she realized that, for the first time in years, she was ready. Ready to let go of the fear, to embrace the life she had been too afraid to claim, and most importantly, ready to open her heart again. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the quiet rustle of the wind. And as Will leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a soft, gentle kiss, Sarah knew that she had finally found her place, not just on the ranch, but in his arms. The ranch, once her burden, was now her home again, filled with the promise of new beginnings and shared dreams.